What's your name? Where are you calling
Malik in
from?
Minnesota.
Oh, hey Malik, how's it going? What's on your mind?
Swell. I wanted to bring up something that you had said yesterday because I've actually made the argument, and I want to hear um, you talk a little bit more about it, which was the idea that if wealthy people are racist, that I forget exactly what you
Hello?
said, but it was wealthy people being racist is disproves that economic anxiety drove Trump support, something along those lines.
No,
And
that
I was
wasn't
just curious about
exactly
it
what
because I support,
Yeah, that
yeah,
wasn't
yeah, yeah, I
exactly
support
what I
Bernie, and I just
said.
wanted to hear what your thoughts were.
You want to debunk me on that argument?
He wants a
No,
debunking
I don't
of
want to
that
debunk
argument.
you.
When
Oh.
people say
Trying to
they're
debunk myself.
when
Oh.
people say rich people are racist and vote Republican, that debunks the economic anxiety.
Oh,
argument.
okay, I got you. All right, I understand. And actually, it's funny. I didn't pull it, but somebody just sent me some research, which I maybe I should have printed it. But basically, there was a lot of research indicating, which, and again, this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, that when in times of economic hardship, that fear perception across race lines increases. So I think they're both true things. But let me get to what you're saying. The argument that people make rests on an incredibly simplistic and reductive reading of both sides of the argument, which again, I don't really fundamentally think are in conflict, but I'll just play along, which is that so-called economic anxiety is the only sort of driver of racism, right? And then on the other hand, this idea that racism is some type of like moral metaphysical force that exists outside of time and history, and just white people just have it as like this disease, and it can't be dealt with really, other than maybe through like kind of symbolic acts. Now, what I think, and so people use this argument, they'll say, well, there's, look at the base of the Republican Party. There's a ton of wealthy white people, and they're obviously voting for and supporting, and at the bare minimal, comfortable with racism, right? Or else there's no way you could be, I forget just supporting Trump. I mean, there's no way you could be supporting avidly Mitt Romney and be aware of all the issues and not have a lot of comfort with a fair amount of racism. Mitt Romney talked about self-deporting. And the point is that, and again, some of it requires a little bit more reading and thinking, and it can't just be reduced to a poll number, but it's the idea that if you're in a position of wealth and a position of status, you will very much want to reinforce narratives and storylines that justify the world as it is.
Reinforce hierarchy.
Reinforce hierarchy. Racism is the main, if not one of the main hierarchies and storylines of the United States. And so then they'll manifest differently. So as an example, when you're going, when you're at some rally and you're doing Trumpian racism, you'll rant about jobs and do a bunch of, the Breitbart, borderline Hitlerian, in my opinion, coverage of the border and all of the exaggerations and lies about crime, right? But then if you're on the other side of the income ladder, another different status, you're going to sit back and crack open the bell curve and go, whoa. Not just, by the way, if you read the whole bell curve, it's definitely, I would say it's an objectively racist book, but it's fundamentally a class justification and stratification book. Oh, we live in a knowledge economy and there's increased inequality. Oh, that's a bummer. Oh, nothing can be done about it because these people have bad brains genetically. That's interesting. See, those are different. They share racism and class, but they're very different types of narratives. And they play on very different types of manifestations of the same thing. But they both have material correlates. And again, we don't need to be, let's be obvious about it, right? Like, one is the classic racist line of dividing up the electorate and using racism and fear to divide people when they have some overlapping class interests. That does exist, as much as, apparently some people want to deny that. That's a real thing. And then when you go to the wealthy end, it's there's no mistake that Charles Murray, one of his recent books, is all about the white underclass. And the problem is that they're socially pathological, right? And because he can't do the genetic stuff in the same way because, but it's all just a culture answer. And that's another big concern I have with some of the direction that I see some of the quote unquote woke discourse going, is I see it really becoming just a bunch of culture answers to economic problems. But that's how I would say their interplay. But Malik, go for it.
I appreciate all that.
Can I just say really quick before, hold on, just one sec. There's like a pivot. Malik, hold on, just one second.
There's a pivot to economics.
Malik, hold on, I'm going to mute you. Just 1 second. Then go and take as much time as you need. But there is no version of what I just said that is rigorous and fair, that denies the centrality of race and racism. It's a analysis of how and why these things are working that is more in relationship, to politics. And again, I'm talking about politics. I'm not talking about various other manifestations of these things, which are huge problems and serious, but not necessarily the same as people's voting patterns, as an example. But anyways, Malik, go ahead, please.
No, I'm talking in terms of politics too. So I agree with most, if not all of that.
Right.
My concern, going all the way back to 2016, is that a lot of Bernie supporters and Bernie surrogate types will often, when faced with a question about inequalities, particularly racial inequalities, will pivot to, well, that's why we need X economic program. And the person on the receiving end of that argument, right, that doesn't actually address their concern. And he already does have a good civil rights record. And so I just think pointing to the civil rights record, pointing to specific policies, I'm going to appoint an attorney general who will, bring back the consent decrees from the Obama era, right?
Yep.
Those things are a way better answer to that than to say, well, universal health care and a jobs program and eliminating debt, it doesn't address the problem. That's all I'm saying.
Well, let me just say this to you. Let me just say this. Top line, I agree with you, right? There's no doubt, particularly with the issues that you just were raising, you need to be saying, I'm going to have a strategy to fight the courts on civil rights suppression and voter suppression, which Republicans and the Supreme Court have been assaulting for, decades and very much in the last decade. And we're going to bring back the consent decree and all. I 100% agree with you, right? Where I want to make it a little bit more complicated, though, is just one, there is an objective difference in this cycle versus 2016. So I think sometimes the reason that, Bernie folks get reactive is because in 2016, and I could even include myself in this, but I wouldn't, but I would just say a lot of people, including people who were ardent Bernie supporters, such as myself, would sometimes level critiques like that. In 2019, most critiques you hear like this in media are uniformly dishonest and bad faith and from people that hate him. And the third thing I would say that really does need to be brought into the mix here, and it's a delicate balance, but it needs to be brought into the mix. 1,000%, if somebody asks Bernie or a surrogate, what are you going to do about voter suppression? What are you going to do about reversal of civil rights? And if he immediately starts talking about Medicare, that is a mistake in that context. I agree with you. And I think there's been improvement on that.
I totally agree on the improvement.
But let me just say,
I hear a lot of people on the ground, so listeners, should talk about that.
Sorry, say that in a second. Let me just add this third thing because I think it's interesting. On the other hand, or not even on the other hand, that has to be synthesized. I have seen, again, a countervailing argument, which is actually to start to say that issues like housing and healthcare are not issues that, of course, first of all, yes, they do apply to everybody, and particularly poor people across the board. And that is ultimately how you're going to build a coalition, and it is ultimately how you're going to deliver these things. But those are apps like Adolph Reed calculated in 2016, and I'm sure it would apply today, that if you just pass the Bernie Sanders agenda on Medicare for all and a couple of other key issues, it would represent the largest wealth redistribution and resource redistribution along racial lines, I believe, since Reconstruction. So when you start having people say that that stuff doesn't overlap or that doesn't speak to people's issues, you are being really dishonest and you're erasing a lot of really important reality. And I would say sometimes when I look at this along class lines, when I talk to people of color from lower and working class backgrounds, they don't have, absolutely, I've heard the same critique you've leveled, which we both agree on, that you need to talk specifically about civil rights and voting rights and so on, no doubt. But there's an immediate, and it tracks with all the polling, like, yes, of course, when you're talking about healthcare disparities, of course, that's a racial issue. And of course, that's an injustice issue. Now, when I talk to friends of mine of color from upper class backgrounds, like other upper class people, they're less preoccupied with the economics. So I think the other thing that starts to come in here is that we are literally you're also just talking about different ways of slicing up and understanding the electorate. And I think, by the way, that's a mistake that people on both sides make, because sometimes when Bernie immediately pivots to poverty and injustice issues, that misses that there's a large middle and upper class. I mean, it's been under assault in this country and not allowed to form and so on, but there are plenty of people of color who are affluent in the middle class, and they might have and do have a different issue set. And, that also is something we have to track. So big picture, Malik, I agree with you. I just think particularly in media, we need to be really smart about how we pull off these conversations, because there's a lot of different things flying. And right now, unfortunately, a lot of bad faith attacks.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm thinking too of like the people who are going to be knocking doors and phone calling, like those are the ones where there just seems to be a constant pivot to that. And if that's not the topic, like if we're talking about specific race issues or, how Trump got elected or whatever, then going to the economics, I think it just turns people away because that's not what they were talking about. And so yeah, but by and large, I agree. So I appreciate it. And I do feel like I have a better grasp.
Well, I hope so.
What you were saying.
I hope so. I hope
Thanks.
I put it across well. I appreciate the call. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Thanks.